tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's talk about one of my biggest pet peeves, and I suspect one that I share with a great many of you tuning in to this show, the federal government's carbon tax, or as it likes to call it, I believe, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which is basically the tax on everything. The tax on your fuel, on your gas heating at home, the tax on anything you buy that's been produced in Canada, on anything that's been shipped to you. It is literally the tax on pretty much every stage of the supply chain, and it's supposedly going to help save the world from the evil scourge that is a greenhouse gas. But at the same time, this is also not something that I am as optimistic in, and I know a lot of you aren't either. Forgetting about the environmental side of the discussion here, let's focus on the economic aspect. A new report from the Fraser Institute says that this carbon tax that we have in Canada, and in fact most of the carbon taxes put in by very similar wealthy nations around the world, don't actually economically meet the criteria necessary to say they are efficient and effective. The report is Carbon Pricing in High-Income OECD Countries. The author is Elmira Aliakbari, who's the Associate Director of Natural Resource Studies at the Fraser Institute and the author of this report. Dr. Aliakbari, thank you very much for coming on. Good to speak with you.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
So let's start off with what it was you really set out to find. When you decided to bring together these countries around the world, what were you looking for?
So it's widely acknowledged that carbon pricing is the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address the issue of climate change. However, some key conditions must be met for carbon pricing to be efficient, or in other words, to be the least costly approach for reducing emissions. The first condition is something we call revenue neutrality, and that means that all the revenues from carbon pricing should be used to reduce other costly taxes in the system, such as reducing personal or business income tax rates. The second condition, which is also related to the first one, is that governments should avoid subsidizing substitutes for carbon-emitting activities, such as subsidizing wind and solar energy sources, because subsidizing these substitutes will increase the cost of reducing emissions and will defeat the whole purpose of carbon pricing, which is allowing the market and prices to find the right substitutes. And the third condition is that the introduction of carbon pricing should trigger the repeal of the existing and corresponding emissions-related regulations. We shouldn't be adding carbon pricing on top of existing regulations. So in our recent study, we examined existing carbon pricing policies in 31 high-income OECD countries to determine whether these existing systems meet the key conditions of a well-designed carbon pricing policies. And we found that no country has implemented a well-designed carbon pricing policy. More specifically, no country is using all the revenues from carbon pricing to reduce other taxes, which help with, improving economic growth. Our study found that 74% of the carbon tax revenues collected in 14 countries on average are simply used as general revenues for the government. Only 14% of the carbon tax revenues, again on average, were returned to taxpayers. And this suggests that existing carbon taxes are mainly used as a tool for governments to raise revenue rather than a mechanism to reduce emissions in the most affordable way possible. In addition, we found that no country that introduced carbon pricing has eliminated the existing and corresponding GHG-related regulations. In fact, most countries have done the opposite, and they have introduced even new regulations following the introduction of carbon pricing. Emission caps, clean fuel standards, renewable power mandates. These are just some examples of these regulations that undermine the cost effectiveness of carbon pricing policies.
I want to talk about some of the specifics you mentioned a moment ago about how the money is spent. But before then, just getting to really the fundamental thesis of this report, am I correct that you're not saying a carbon tax itself is a bad thing, but just there's a right way and a wrong way to do it? Or is it that so many of these mechanisms you think would be required for it to be better designed are just not happening in carbon tax policies that we see around the world?
That's a really great point. Most economists, including me, believe that carbon pricing is the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we believe that the way we are designing and implementing those policies are really important. While tackling climate change is a priority, we should really pay attention to the way that we are designing and implementing these policies. If we have a well-designed carbon pricing policy, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an efficient and productive way. And this is basically what our report is about.
So let's talk about how it's spent, because I know this was a big part of the discussion in Canada about whether the money that the government brings in through the carbon tax had to be used for specific emission reduction programs or whether it could just go into general revenue. Why does that matter? I mean, in the sense of the effect a carbon tax would have on consumers, on industry, it's the same. How does it matter from an efficiency standpoint, how the government spends the money?
So the revenue neutrality condition explicitly says that the collected revenue from carbon tax should be used to reduce other costly taxes in the system. And the reason is that, and this is really important, the reason is that this is a bit technical, but I try to put it simple. When we introduce a carbon tax or any other form of tax, we create an economic inefficiency, which results in something economists call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is a cost to society resulting from an inefficient allocation of resources within a market. So the idea is that when we are having a carbon tax, that creates some efficiency costs. So to mitigate that efficiency cost, we should be using revenues from carbon tax to reduce other costly taxes. And, for example, in Canada, the federal government is now using its carbon tax revenues to it's using 90% of its carbon tax revenues to recycle it back to households through issuing lump sum rebates. While issuing lump sum rebates, generates some economic efficiency benefits, but the benefits would be larger, if we reduce other taxes. Many papers have shown that when we use carbon tax revenues and recycle them back to the economy in a form of tax cuts, that would result in greater economic efficiency compared to a case where we just issue lump sum rebates. So, and the intuition is also simple because remember, those taxes, such as income taxes, they discourage work, they discourage investment and saving. So when we reduce those taxes, we can help more with improving economic growth. And that's why, it's really important that all the revenues that we are collecting from carbon pricing should be used to reduce other taxes. And this is not something that the federal government is currently doing.
One thing I'm curious about, and in the list of countries against which you've compared Canada, the 14 OECD countries that have implemented carbon taxes, there's a huge range of what that actual tax rate is. I think Japan was the lowest at $3 per ton of CO2 emissions, all the way up to Sweden at, I think, 127 or so, and Canada on the lower end at $15. And I mean, obviously, as a Canadian taxpayer, I just don't like tax in general. So even if it's lower than other countries, I would still say that there's a question about whether it's too high. But are all of these countries comparable? I mean, does Canada, with its industry that's heavily resource focused, have a place and have an ability to compare it with the economies and greenhouse gas emissions plans in Sweden, Japan, and so on, where they don't have that resource sector as strongly as we do?
So we cannot directly compare those taxes among countries due to some reason, because there are differences in those programs. For instance, in terms of, in some countries, some sectors get compensation or some sectors get exempted from paying carbon taxes, or in some countries we see that the tax is applied to all the emissions basically generated in the country, whereas in some other countries it's only a share of emission, a portion of emission, not the whole basically emissions generated. So because of those differences within countries, we cannot really directly compare those carbon taxes between countries.
So I guess the big question is, I mean, are we talking about tweaks that could be made to Canada's carbon tax in order to bring it alignment with what you're saying? Or would it really have to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch to qualify as being an effective and efficient plan?
Yeah, I think we can make some tweaks or reforms, to make it basically a well-designed carbon pricing policy. Another main issue in Canada is that the federal carbon tax is accompanied by so many other regulatory measures. For example, we have and all those regulations have the same target or objective, and that's actually the issue. For example, we have a regulation to phase out coal-fired power plants by 2030. We have a regulation on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. We have an ethanol regulation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. The federal government has also, proposed this sweeping regulation called Clean Fuel Standard to decarbonize fuel use in the country. So all these regulations that have the same objective, they have the same target. When we accompany those regulations with the federal carbon tax, all those regulations are going to increase the cost of reducing emissions without generating any significant marginal benefit. So that's one of the main issues with federal government's carbon tax. The other issue is, as I discussed, is that the way the federal government is recycling its carbon tax revenues is not ideal. This is not what economists have in mind. The federal government should be using carbon tax revenues to reduce other costly taxes, such as personal or business income tax rates. Again, this is not happening in Canada. And we have also seen that the federal government is now using 10% of its carbon tax revenues to basically pursue some environmental goals, because that 10% goes to small and medium-sized companies and some other organizations such as schools and hospitals for their energy efficiency programs, meaning that the government is kind of using that revenue to pursue some environmental goals. And this is not something that we should be doing. Again, we should be having a well-designed carbon pricing policy so that we can deliver emission reductions in an efficient way.
The report from the Fraser Institute, Carbon Pricing in High-Income OECD Countries, and you can check that out online. We'll have a link in the description box. The author of the report, Dr. Elmira Aliakbari, Associate Director of Natural Resources for the Fraser Institute, joins me on the line now. Dr. Aliakbari, thank you very much for coming on today. Great to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.